Hey, what's buzzing with my cousins? Thank you for doubling back and tapping into another episode of Chop Shop with Mr. Chop G himself, Johnny Tsunami. In today's episode, we'll break down some underappreciated subtext, in my opinion, from the 1998 teen thriller Disturbing Behavior. Then we'll dissect what I consider to be a perfect example of attempting to normalize an otherwise controversial concept. Hey, so if you can hear me, it means you're already locked in, so fire up and let's trip off this thought. Whether you're a movie connoisseur with a taste for nostalgia, or you're one of the chosen ones who can recall society pre-Y2K, looking back at trending themes from movies in the late 90s, it's fairly easy to notice ideals once considered socially taboo become more commonplace. In '99, popular horror flicks like The Blair Witch Project and the House on Haunted Hill remake saw occult premises pushed to the forefront. Even in comedy, from Little Nicky to Idle Hands, we saw that not even our favorite water boy nor our beloved Pee Wee football quarterback were safe from the influences of the era. If we look a year prior, we notice that '98 had its eyes set elsewhere. While this very well may be considered a golden era for teen horror across the board, 1998 in particular seemed to have a slight infatuation with different concepts of society, losing its sense of individuality. The heavily promoted Dimension film, The Faculty, took a more invasion of the body snatchers approach to what can otherwise be considered a whodunit. This box office success saw a small town efficiently taken over by parasites. Centered around the students and faculty of its public high school, the hosts would lose their true selves in an instant while outwardly appearing to have reached their full potential overnight. Along that same road, but maybe a lane over, you have the film we'll be discussing today, MGM's runner-up in high school thriller, Disturbing Behavior. Now, whereas the two flicks have some obvious similarities in the overall plot, the point that I hope to illustrate is that it's the subtext that made these movies appeal to the imagination. On the surface alone, the plot behind The Faculty might come off as a tired rehash to the sci-fi community, while at the same time sounding too far-fetched to others to suspend their disbelief long enough to enjoy the ride. Looking at Disturbing Behavior and The Faculty alike, it's not necessarily the loss of individuality and free will alone that's the most unsettling. It's the fact that these films quietly make you question how much of yourself you might be willing to lose to achieve your personal definition of perfection. Posing this type of question to a teenage audience taps into the angst and insecurities that we've all felt at that age. This is where subtext can be so essential to making a plot with an unfamiliar concept relatable nonetheless. In the opening scene, for example, it's not so much that it's a couple of teens in a car at a cliche makeout point that actually draws you in. It's the obvious difference in social circles that they appear to be in outside of the car. As the dialogue progresses, we quickly learn that while the boyfriend is usually the aggressor, Andy here is curbing this girl like free parking. As Mary Jo attempts to seduce Andy, it paints a picture of her being far more experienced than Andy, which raises the question of how somebody so straight edge even bagged her in the first place. It's not until things start to go Mary Jo's way that we get our first hint in the movie's exposition that things in Cradle Bay aren't what they seem. When things between them start to heat up, what for the first time looks more like a typical hookup suddenly takes a sharp left turn. And in the blink of an eye, Andy has snapped her neck after a mental glitch is triggered. There's barely any time at all to process the hookup turn homicide before the car is approached by two officers on patrol. Just as the anticipation starts to build for Andy to get booked, we're thrown another curveball. As Andy exits the car for a casual conversation with the boys, it's clear that he's still glitched out and not all there. As one officer seems to see nothing out of the ordinary with Andy, the other one has a look in his car. Before he can react to a body in the front seat, good old Andy steals his gun and wipes him down. Now, not only does the other officer allow Andy to flee the murder scene, he takes it upon himself to dispose of his partner and Mary Jo's bodies, handling any other loose ends that might lead back to Andy. All of this going on within sight of our first main character, Gavin, A heavy stoner with by far the best vocabulary I've ever seen. Careful not to alert the officer, Gavin gets rid of his doobie and slips away. A seemingly irrelevant detail in the moment, but establishing that Gavin is 420 friendly now lays the foundation for more subtext to come. Following the incident meant to shed light on the bigger picture of the plot, the story moves into the social climate of the student body. A quick look into the home life of our protagonist Steve lets us know that his family's move from Chicago is meant to be a fresh start from something traumatic. At the school, a class system is established. The students are segregated into cliques, from motorheads and skaters to bookworms and stoners, each group being explained by their hobbies and drug of choice. Now, of course, this helps the viewer get a feel for the school, but what this is more so meant to do is highlight different imperfections. The bookworms are socially awkward. The motorheads are dim-witted and brutes. The skaters seem to lack focus, and the stoners are outcasts, viewed as burnouts lacking any real ambition. This understanding helps accentuate the contrast between the typical Cradle Bay team and the clique atop the social hierarchy, the Blue Ribbons. In the film world, this type of visual contrasting is known as juxtaposition. Simply put, things look better or worse by comparison. Now, as the story moves into conflict and we gain some insight into the Blue Ribbons, a popular but controversial concept starts to rear its head. The first red flag raises when we can spot Andy among his Blue Ribbon buddies, going about his normal routine as if he didn't just catch 2 bodies. A second red flag pops up when you start to realize that aggression, whether passive or straightforward, is the Blue Ribbon's MO. This presents the possibility that Andy might not be the only menace in the group. After being rejected, Chug, another key Blue Ribbon member, can't keep his eyes off Gavin's homegirl. His glares turn to stares as he fantasizes about her, leading to a familiar reaction. Repressing his urges makes Chug glitch out and become dangerously violent, just like Andy. Their glowing red pupils hint that something artificial is connected to these psychotic breaks. Things with the Blue Ribbons get even stranger when they slide on the greaser that one of them fought in class. Responding to an ad for Mustang parts, the motorhead is lured into an ambush. Completely surrounded by weapons, we're led to believe that this is soon to be body number 3. It seems to be confirmed when we see the Blue Ribbons with his gorgeous 69 sports roof taking a sledgehammer to it in a public spectacle. But when the new and improved Richard emerges from the flock to help destroy his own whip, we realize that this act is symbolic. In celebration of his rebirth as a Blue Ribbon, Richard is declaring his old self dead, killing off his former identity as Dickie. This is the subtext laying foundation for a concept that's proven hard for some to swallow. In my opinion, disturbing behavior isn't just one of the most straightforward examples of MK Ultra, a real-life CIA operation striving to master mind control. This movie also is one of the earliest attempts I've seen at normalizing the idea of chip implants. An idea once thought born from pure fiction, but one that we know is moving closer and closer to hitting the market, if you've heard anything about Elon Musk and his Neuralink chip. By this point in the story, Gavin has felt Steve to be trustworthy enough to open up about witnessing Andy kill 2 people. He would also explain that the Blue Ribbon program offered by the school was still fairly new, recently kicked into full swing by its creator. He would tell Steve that just like Richard, every member of the Blue Ribbons was completely different before losing themselves to serve the agenda of the program. Bro even pulls out receipts, trying to prove that if anyone would know that their new sense of superiority and fits of rage were traits connected to the program, it would be their ex-best friend. In his last efforts to convince Steve that the program was a literal brainwashing and reprogramming process, Gavin sneaks him on the campus to listen in on the Blue Ribbon committee meeting. Steve learns that at the head of the program is the new counselor, Dr. Caldecott, who finds his candidates for recruitment both by spotting ideal traits through counseling them and by parents' requests for enrollment. Being minors, the teens have zero say in the matter. as Steve would find out when, to his surprise, he sees that the newest kid sold out by his parents is to be Gavin himself. Unfortunately for Gavin, Steve isn't as open-minded as expected, not believing a word despite everything presented to him. The reason for his skepticism boils back down to subtext, playing off of the class system established earlier. Steve doesn't believe Gavin because quietly, like the rest of the school, Steve kinda sees Gavin as a burnout who's simply paranoid from smoking too much loud. Having just moved to town, Steve was really only tolerating Gavin in order to get closer to his homegirl, Rachel. Steve initially turned his nose up at Gavin as he introduced himself fresh off a smoke session, but didn't necessarily see any other better options for friends elsewhere. After Gavin storms out, genuinely fearing for his life, Steve is instead convinced that Gavin is unstable, which is actually a projection of Steve's own past trauma. His older brother losing his battle with mental health and taking his own life drove his family from Chicago to Cradle Bay, and Gavin revealing his gun for protection hits a raw nerve with Steve. He presses Gavin for it and takes the piece, leaving Gavin to fend for himself. Steve's reaction to Gavin's intel is actually an accurate reflection of how the subject is viewed in real life. MK Ultra and Project Monarch programming are documented experiments conducted on real people, listing distinct side effects and triggers, like phrases, for example. Taking the conversation public usually results in scoffs and people questioning your sanity while mocking your sobriety, or lack thereof. The story starts to reach boiling point the next day when Gavin finally makes his appearance after being a no-show for morning classes. After making a point to publicly cut ties with his former circle, Gavin's rebirth is complete after not only allowing Steve to get blended up in the sea of Yale blue and yellow, he deals Steve the final blow to drop him. I found it interesting that with the exception of his makeover, Gavin's overall personality didn't seem to change as drastically as the ribbons that came before him. Aside from displaying more confidence and focus, which is meant to make the audience seriously consider the benefits of the trade-off, it was still in many ways the same Gavin that gave Steve that gut shot. Specifically, Gavin's vocabulary and his delivery remained the same, meaning that those traits didn't need improvement. So for all the bud bro was twisting up, his speech and most importantly his logic was perfectly fine. In a goodbye video clip stored in a case with the Skull and Bones logo eerily similar to the well-known Yale fraternities, Gavin drops the location of where he suspects the troubled teens are taken for the procedure. His tip leads Rachel and Steve to a mental facility just outside of town, where they learn the final piece of the puzzle to this highly unethical practice. The blue ribbon's shared perspective on morality and new personality traits are stored on chips. The chips are then surgically attached to the optical nerves and routed to the brain where information is downloaded. The chip can then serve as a filter to repress any signs of individuality and any behavior based on impulse, or teenage hormones for that matter. The real-life equivalent to this device sounds a lot like the Neuralink chip, described to replace a small portion of skull rather than running through the eyes, but wiring through the brain nonetheless. This tool is presented to the public as a means to improve imperfections or conditions like blindness and paralysis. In the film, this also explains why becoming aroused caused Andy, Chug, and Lorna to all glitch out, the inferior chip designs frying once the teens were overstimulated. The icing on the cake is when Steve and Rachel realize that in his obsession to perfect the procedure, the sadistic psychologist turned counselor, Dr. Caldecott, was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to achieve the results he demanded, forcing her into a trial run of the procedure and then dumping her in the facility once it failed and shattered her psyche. With their minds finally wrapped around the big picture, the two race to keep the blue ribbon elites in training from moving on to the Ivy Leagues and later integrating into society, becoming leaders of the not really free world. Walking puppets, all under the thumb of a single entity, serving the agenda of a single organization on what would grow to be a global scale. So while at a glance, disturbing behavior might come across like a mid-tier teen thriller about a hidden hand helping spoiled brats get away with murder, a look into the subtext shows that in the grand scheme of things, the actions of these exploited teens are actually symptoms of the elite's recruitment process, as they handpick the next generation of corrupt leaders and compromised influencers. Well, with all that said, I hope that my shared perspective has helped shed some light on subtext and how, when used properly, it can be an effective tool to help roll out questionable concepts to the masses. And if nothing else, I hope this breakdown at least got your wheels spinning and made you trip off a few eerie similarities to things we may overlook in our own reality, because the truth can sometimes be so strange that it mirrors fiction. If what you heard made sense, don't forget to hit the like button and help other people trip out. If you enjoyed this breakdown and would like to stay in the loop on future episodes, click the subscribe button too. That way we can keep you up to speed and in the loop whenever new content is posted. If you can think of other examples of foreshadowing or predictive programming in other movies and TV shows, please feel free to drop it in the comment section. I would be more than happy to cover any piece that you may have all picked up on as well. That's a wrap for this episode. Thank you all for tapping in, and I look forward to the next session of Chop Shop here on Chop GTV. Easy, y'all.